Hey, what's up, guys? Hey, just a really quick sort of discussion video for you today. One of the questions that should be asked, I think, more often and that people don't like to discuss for a variety of reasons is whether the athletes of today in a sport like baseball are better than athletes were in the past, or whether they are worse. This is an important topic to talk about. It's an important discussion to have, especially if you're talking about comparing players across eras and making sure that there is sort of an even and level playing field of some sort upon which you can make a comparison. So you've probably already seen it on the blog. I have started a series that is devoted to this topic alone. The place where this topic came up was in an old discussion on Baseball Think Factory back in early 2006, and really around Christmas 2005, actually, in which people were talking about doing a league with Diamond Mine Baseball that did happen, involving some of the greatest players of all time. And there was sort of a philosophic opposition that arose to doing this project because it was so obvious. They said that players of today are faster than ever before and stronger than ever before and can simply do things that players before could not ever do. And that might seem a little bit obvious to you. I think a lot of people will say, look, we've had records in track and field or records in swimming and records in other sports that are clear world records. We keep setting new world records. Certain athletes will do that. Therefore, it must be that athletes in general are better today than before. We do have some problems, though, when you think about that in terms of baseball. One of the biggest problems that we have is that the ability to run quickly alone or the ability to swim well or something is not necessarily a skill that's very easily transferable to baseball. A lot of what makes a baseball player a good player has to do with good hand-eye coordination, the ability to anticipate a pitch if you are a batter, or if you're a pitcher, the ability to make the ball do things that are kind of odd and curve in different and strange directions. And I would also add, as a pitcher, the ability to do so without completely gassing yourself right at the very beginning of the game. The truth is that we cannot look at baseball statistics and come to a clear and firm argument as to whether players are better now or than they were before, or are worse now than they were before. There are people who've tried to do that. Most famous, I think, is Stephen Jay Gould, who wrote a book many, many years ago looking at batting average and concluding that the overall level of play in Major League Baseball has gone up over time because you don't see as many players who hit, around 400 or so, which is an okay argument until you come across guys like George Brett in 1980 who came very, very close to doing so, or you come across guys who look like Superman like Barry Bonds in 2001, 2002. Now, we could argue that, well, there were steroids involved in the Bonds case, but then we have another problem because we know that a number of pitchers were also taking steroids. And as people like to forget, a lot of the guys who took steroids were actually not stars. They were sort of like second tier type players. It's not clear that there's that much of a correlation between steroid use and playing like a Superman. And this is another topic that people really don't like to talk about. I would argue that modern players would probably have a very difficult time playing if they had to go back and play in an older era like 1908 with travel by train instead of by airplane, sleeping on train berths, playing with big flannel uniforms on or wool or whatever they were using, and having to play in the hot sun in places like St. Louis in the middle of the summer, and having to play all day games and all of the other things that go along with that. Also, having to use the equipment at the time would be difficult for a modern player because you have a little finger mitt instead of having a big glove that has all sorts of webbing and places where you can catch the ball. There are arguments that have come up from time to time that perhaps pitchers are better now than ever before. I see this all the time. Well, average velocity is up, which means that pitchers are just better than ever before. That argument kind of falls apart when you realize that the way that we've tracked the velocity of pitches has changed a lot over the past few years, let alone over the course of 100 plus years. There's really not a very good basis of comparison that we have. I know that there have been studies. I know that people have talked about this stuff. Frankly, I've not seen any sort of evidence that convinces me that the game is just simply so much better today than it ever was before. In fact, you could argue that the opposite is true because today, great athletes tend to gravitate towards playing basketball if they're tall enough, or otherwise playing American football. At least great American athletes do. You no longer see the sort of player that you saw earlier on, guys like Dave Winfield, who turned down basketball and football to play baseball. You don't see that anymore. Can you think of anybody who's active today who fits that category? I can't. So, I mean, there's a lot of things that have changed that really kind of make you question, is it really true that the talent pool is better today than ever before? If you want to talk about things like Major League Baseball teams taking players from foreign countries, it is true that this didn't happen frequently before. But it's also true that part of the reason why you see so many players from Central America these days is because they're cheap, not because they're necessarily better at an amateur level. And that is, again, when we start touching on really sensitive topics that I think a lot of people in Major League Baseball's corporate structure don't want us to talk about. So there's a lot to be said here, and there's a lot to unpack. And this is even before we start talking about issues such as racial exclusion in baseball, which was an awful thing that happened, and which is really a shame to have happened because it's like impossible to work around this. I mean, what are we going to do? How are we going to address this issue without simply throwing out, huge reams of statistics and pretending that stuff just didn't happen? I mean, there's no real good way to adjust for this statistically if that's what we're looking at. It's important to have this debate, and it's important to look at this stuff because it helps provide sort of a certain, smell test for some sort of statistics that may come along. I showed you twice now that on Baseball Reference, if you use its so-called statistic neutralization tool and take players and put them in different eras, you're going to get really weird statistics that don't belong in the eras they're supposed to be in. Right? If we're going to take statistics from one era and change them so that every player has a level playing field, we need to know how we're doing this. We need to know what the adjustments are. And in particular, we need to know what we're going to do, not just with outliers, but with everybody, right? There's one method that I like a lot, which is one that is unfortunately for us somewhat proprietary. This is through Bill Staff over at Skeetersoft, who created a method to allow for this type of play to be made. And my understanding of what this does is it will take players, say, from, 1908 or something like that, and we'll adjust them over to a different era, say 1977. I think that's around the era that he uses. But we'll do so in a way so that players will be adjusted to sort of their real-life counterparts in 1977. This is, of course, based on this presumption that baseball playing ability is kind of the same over the course of time. So Ty Cobb, for example, probably won't hit like 420 in your league in 1977, but he'll hit around where the leading hitters in average hit. Instead of having basically no home run power and a lot of triples, he'll probably have some home run power, but will still be fast, maybe sort of a Ricky Henderson type player, right? That's sort of the idea, which is that you kind of take the statistics and you mold them a little bit, and you do the unthinkable and kind of change the way that the slugging percentage and all of this stuff is distributed. The reason why we talk about this is because if we don't do this, if we just use an algorithmic approach, we're going to end up with things like Barry Bonds going back to 1908 and hitting 60 home runs, which is ridiculous. I mean, if you know anything about how the game was played in 1908, and if you assume that Bonds uses the same equipment, there's just no way it's going to happen. You also have problems with things like, as I showed before, Owen Wilson coming out in 1912, going to hit in even Coors Field and hitting like 40 triples. I mean, a lot of those triples are probably going to end up being home runs, right? Because he's not playing in Pittsburgh in 1912 anymore. So this is sort of the thing that you have to think about when you're talking about normalization. It's an important step to take. As I showed before, if you go over to Baseball Reference and you look at their neutral statistics calculation tool, the explanation behind it, they will say, oh, well, we just ignore all of these things that people talk about. You can't ignore them. If you go in with the assumption that baseball was much better in the past than it was today, then by default, players from the past are going to look better than the players today. Then you're going to say things that I read as a kid like, oh, look at how great all these hitters were in the 30s. They all hit over 300, right? If you come in with the assumption that baseball today is better than it ever was in the past, then you're going to expect that teams from today will go back in the past and completely beat up on the competition, right? I don't think either of those are the same. My personal feeling is that the game has probably been around the same overall average level of play over time. I've not seen any sort of statistics or any sort of argument to convince me otherwise. If you have one, feel free to share it. I'm actually interested in knowing what you have to think. The nice thing, though, about assuming that the game has been around the same level and that there is sort of this major league the talent level that has remained more or less consistent over time is that we can make these comparisons, and we have a good basis for comparison. And then when we look at the stats, we can tell right away if a certain neutralization or normalization technique passes the smell test or not. Does this matter if you don't care about baseball simulations, you only care about like WAR and these other statistics? Yes, it does. And the reason why it matters is because a lot of us will use neutralized statistics such as OBS plus and anything with a plus behind it to look at the player comparisons. Well, if we assume that players are comparable across eras, then we can look at this across eras and see how players did relative to their individual seasons. If we even come in with the basic assumption that, well, the quality of play has increased over time from the very beginning to the modern day of baseball, we run into some problems. We run into some conceptual problems when we're trying to do these basic comparisons of neutralized statistics, because we have to adjust for this change in baseball talent over time. Again, I don't see any proof of that. I don't see any evidence for it. I don't see any reason to need to believe it. As long as we're dealing with baseball, I would say in 1893 or later, when the rules were more or less finally codified, I think that we can make some pretty safe assumptions about this. Love to know what your thoughts are. I know it's a controversial subject, but if you don't talk about this beforehand, then any discussion will turn into a flame war. Trust me, it doesn't matter if you're on Twitter or on Delphi or on Facebook or any other message board. It'll turn into just a flame war unless we talk about the things that we assume. I would also add in closing that Major League Baseball's marketing arm definitely has an incentive to try to make us believe that baseball today is better than it ever was before. I don't think that I buy into that. Anyway, there you go. Talk to you later. Bye.